Alright guys, so we're going to pick back up, as I said, with motions that our joints can make. There are various motions that our body can do, such as flexion and extension. Flexion meaning bending a extremity towards your body or decreasing the angle between bones and parts of the body. So when you go to flex, okay, when you're trying to show off your muscles, that is a motion of a joint. Extension would be straightening that body part away from the body. Abduction is movement away from the midline, whereas adduction is moving toward the midline. Circumduction is a combination of the previous motions, as such as with moving at the shoulder joint and moving through a 360 degree. So for example, doing arm circles. Pronation, pronation and supination are movements that are exclusive to the foot and the hands, such as turning your forearm in a way to where the palm of your hand is turned towards your back, whereas supination is turning it to where your hand is towards the front. We also have various joints that we may have, such as the ball and socket joint. This is a joint that permits the widest range of motion, such as flexion and extension. Examples of these joints would be at your shoulders and hips. Your hinged joint, such as at your elbow, your knees, and fingers, permit only flexion and extension. And certain joints can only move in certain ways, such as your elbow joints are only able to move forward, whereas your knee joints have backward movement, so that hence why it's a hinge. Your pivot joints allow for a turning motion, such as the joints between the head and neck at the first and second cervical vertebrae. This allows you to be able to pivot your head left and right, as well as up and down. You have gliding joints. This is where one bone would slide across another, such as the joints within the small bones in your hands and feet. Saddle joints, this allows limited movement. For example, would be the ankle allowing the foot to turn inward slightly as it moves up and down. Condyloid joints is a modified ball and socket joint that permits limited motion in two directions, such as the wrist. It allows the hand to move up and down as well as side to side, but not to rotate completely. This would be your joint. So here's your ball and socket joint, a condyloid joint, gliding joint, hinge joint, pivot joint, and a saddle joint. Within the joint, so obviously you have your two bones, okay? You have a synovial membrane that protects the joint, as well as ligaments that connects the two bones together. You have cartilage within it. This cartilage acts as a buffer to help protect the bones and try to reduce friction the best you can. You also have a joint cavity. Within this cavity, you have a fluid called synovial fluid that acts as a lubricant. Who here has a tendency to pop their knuckle? Me, I'll admit, I'm one of them. When you pop your knuckles, who thinks that they're actually popping, cracking a bone? You're actually not. When you crack your knuckles, or you crack your neck, whatever, you're actually causing a shift in that synovial fluid from one side to the other. And that's what you are hearing. You're hearing it pop from one side to the other. When we have a bone that's become injured or fractured, it can lead to major bleeding from the bone as well as the surrounding tissue. The reason being is that our bones are living tissue with a rich blood supply. So when there's a loss of continuity within the structure of the bone, when you have this fracture, these sharp fragments that fragment off of it can injure surrounding tissue such as nerves, blood vessels, and various connective tissue. However, it is important to note that bones, as I said, bones are living tissue, and they have veins and arteries that flow through them. So even if no major arteries or anything are fractured, even just a bone breaking can cause these vessels within the bone to become torn or ruptured. Y'all give me 1 second. Alright, sorry about that, guys. So like I was saying, if you have a bone that's become fractured, it can lead to severe bleeding just from the bone itself. A patient, for example, if they have a fractured femur, they can lose anywhere from 1 to 2,000 milliliters of blood. Whereas a bleeding pelvic fracture can cause the patient to lose his entire blood volume of 7 to 8 liters just into the pelvic cavity. So when assessing a patient who has suffered a bone fracture, we also want to look for signs and symptoms of bleeding within the fracture site. So if the bleeding is severe, we want to be looking for those signs and symptoms of shock that we will cover later on. So we have bones. These bones that have arteries and veins that come within. So you have your compact bone, you have your bone marrow, which is where our red blood cells are made. Within our muscular system, we have these muscles allow movement within our body by causing contractions in response to nerve impulses. Excuse me. So these cells of a muscle are called fibers because they are usually long and thread-like in appearance. Each muscle then has a countless number of bundles of closely packed, overlapping fibers that are bound together by connective tissue. Now, within our muscular, we have 3 different types of muscle. We have skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle, or our voluntary muscles, is what we can actually consciously move. So when we want to move our hands or we want to walk, whatever, these are our voluntary muscles. I can consciously control them. Our smooth muscles, or our involuntary muscles, are the muscles that make up our organs. These are the muscles that we don't have to consciously think about for them to move. So, for example, when I swallow, I have smooth muscles that line my esophagus. So I'm not having to sit there. I eat something and I go swallow, swallow, swallow. Food gets in my stomach. Digest, digest, digest. It does all of that on their own. The final type of muscle is cardiac muscle. These muscles are exclusive to just our heart. And the great thing about cardiac muscle, and we'll cover this more in detail when we get to our cardiovascular chapters, but the great thing about the heart, about these muscles, it has the property known as automaticity, which means it generates its impulses on its own. So I can get my head chopped off, and when I get my head chopped off, I'm no longer breathing because now that's been severed, that connection, because breathing is controlled within our brainstem. But the heart, because it has its own automaticity and it contracts on its own, is not reliant on the brain. It would still be able to beat until eventually you bleed out. This is a diagram of your actual musculature. I would look over it and have an idea of what some of these are, such as where your triceps and your deltoid and your biceps are. your pectoralis major, which makes up your chest, your rectus abdominis, and your external oblique. Now, am I going to be testing you on these? No. Now, if you take anatomy and physiology, you will be tested on the muscular system. As I said, you have 3 different types of muscles. You have your skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Within your respiratory system, the respiratory system, it has various functions as well. The body can store food for weeks and water for days. So if I don't eat, I can last for a couple weeks. I'll be hungry, obviously, but I can last. And I can last a couple days without water. However, the body only stores enough oxygen to where if I had no oxygen, I could only last a few minutes before I start having issues. So simple inhalation normally provides the body with the oxygen that we need. However, if oxygen supply is cut off, such as if we are drowning or we are choking, brain cells will actually begin to die within just 5 minutes. Now, this also assists with the removal of carbon dioxide within our body, and it also assists with the buffering of our pH level within our body, which we will cover in more detail when we get to our respiratory chapter. Within our respiratory system, we have our nasal cavity. Our nasal cavity helps cleans and warms the air that we breathe in. You have your pharynx and larynx. This connects to your trachea and helps produce sound. You have your bronchial tubes, which is the passageways inside your lung. And you have your trachea. This transports air from your oral and nasal cavity down your throat. So it goes through your esophagus, through the epiglottis, past the epiglottis, down your trachea, breaks off into 2 bronchi and into your bronchial tubes. And then you have your lungs, which is the actual site of gas exchange between air and blood. Your airway is divided into an upper and lower portion. Your upper airway is everything from the larynx up, and your lower airway is everything from the larynx down. Your epiglottis protects your larynx and lower airway from you accidentally getting food or liquids into your lungs. Within your upper airway, you have your nose and mouth, your pharynx, your nasopharynx and oropharynx, your nasopharynx being the pharynx of your nose, your oropharynx being the pharynx of your mouth. And then you have your laryngopharynx, which if you look in your book on page 145, is just below where your oropharynx is, just above the epiglottis, where your larynx is. So it's that space between your pharynx and the larynx. Within your lower airway, you have the larynx, which the larynx is the anterior portion of the throat. This eventually hardens up as you age. This also has a prominent portion which makes up your Adam's apple. This also contains your thyroid and cricoid cartilage. Your larynx is also where your vocal box is. Then you have your trachea, which we discussed earlier, which is the structure that carries air to your lungs. Your bronchi, which are your main stems, your two main tubes, one that branches off into each lung from the larynx. Excuse me, from your trachea. Your bronchi then break off into smaller areas, which is your bronchioles. And your bronchioles, it kind of looks like the branches of a tree. These bronchioles are then lined with smooth muscle and constrict and dilate based off of certain stimuli, which we'll go into more detail in our respiratory chapter. And then you have your alveoli, which is where the actual air sacs are, which is where a network of capillaries also run through, and this forms your respiratory membrane. This is the actual site where gas exchange occurs within the lungs. The principal organ of respiration within are your lungs, which are two large lobed organs that house thousands of tiny alveolar sacs responsible for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You have a thin layer of connective tissue called the visceral pleura, which covers the outer surface of your lungs. So the space between your ribs and the lungs is called, or that membrane is called, the visceral pleura. You then have a layer of thicker, more elastic tissue called the parietal pleura, which covers the internal chest wall. Between these two layers is the pleural cavity, which is a tiny space with negative pressure that allows the lungs to stay inflated with air. You then have a diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped muscle, which is your primary muscle, which providing action for airflow into the lungs. The diaphragm also separates your thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And we'll go more into the physiology behind respirations later, but just wanted to kind of give you an idea of it. So see, this is where you have your visceral pleura. So the protective barrier for the lungs. And then the parietal pleura, which runs your thoracic wall. The mediastinum, which is where your heart is contained. Your trachea, and your two left and right main stem bronchi. Oop, uh-oh. Stand by. Do. I accidentally pushed a button. There we go. Alright, sorry about that. So you have a normal bronchiole here in picture A, and when a patient has such as an asthma attack, it causes a constriction of the bronchiole. So when this happens, it almost feels like breathing out of a coffee straw for these patients. In infants and children, there are some anatomical differences between us, such as children, they tend to have a smaller nose and mouth. And in children, because of the smaller mouth, their tongue is proportionally larger compared to that of an adult. Their trachea is also much more narrow than in an adult, and it's also very flexible. So it's easily constricted, and that's why when we go to open up a patient's airway, we want to make sure that we don't open it up too far. When you get ready to ventilate, there are two portions of it. You have inhalation and exhalation. During inhalation, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, so the muscles between the ribs, these contract, increasing the size of the thoracic cavity. The diaphragm moves slightly downward, and the rib cage moves upward and out. This creates an increase in negative pressure within the chest, which causes air to flow into our lungs. During exhalation, the opposite happens. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax, the thoracic cavity decreases, you have an increase in positive pressure, and thus causing air to force out. The diaphragm, it receives the stimulation to move from what's called the phrenic nerve, which exits the spinal cord between vertebrae C3 and C5. So if you have an injury anywhere between those spinal columns or spinal vertebrae, the phrenic nerve may be damaged and thus causing the diaphragm not being able to receive that impulse to contract, thus not allowing the patient to be able to breathe spontaneously on their own. That's why we have a mnemonic. C3, never breathe. To help us remember that the C3 nerve is where it's at. As you can see, everything moves out, air comes in. Everything relaxes, air goes out. Within our lungs, we breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide, but it has to come from somewhere, right? The carbon dioxide does. Well, when we breathe in, as I said, within our alveoli, there's a thin wall that makes up between the alveoli and capillaries, where the alveoli capillary exchange occurs, where oxygen-rich air enters the alveoli during inspiration, passes this membrane into the capillaries, and thus into the bloodstream. It goes from an area of high pressure oxygen to an area of low pressure oxygen. Well, where that oxygen is going is high in carbon dioxide, so it then transfers across that membrane back into the alveoli for us to breathe out the carbon dioxide. Okay? So when we breathe in, oxygen goes into the capillaries. When we breathe out, carbon dioxide shifts from the capillaries back into our lungs for us to then exhale. Blood enters the heart enters the lungs through the pulmonary capillary, goes through the process of osmosis, diffusion, CO2 out, red blood, O2 in, and then you have your oxygenated blood. Adequate breathing is characterized by an adequate respiratory rate and tidal volume. Respiratory rate is the number of breaths a patient takes in 1 minute, whereas tidal volume, which is abbreviated as VT, is the amount of air the patient breathes in and out with one regular breath. And now there's a wide variety of normal ranges of respiratory rates based off the patient, based off their age. Such as with an adult, the normal average is 12 to 20 breaths per minute. Elderly, 20 to 22 because of hardening of the lungs and various comorbid medical conditions. Within children, it can be anywhere from 18 to 37 breaths per minute. Where in infants, it can be anywhere from 30 to as high as 60 breaths per minute. And as they continue to age, their respiratory rate will continually decrease, and their tidal volume will increase as they continue to grow. Now, when a patient breathes, they should be regular in rhythm no matter what their age is. And it should be free of unusual sounds such as wheezing. The chest should expand in an outward and equal with each breath, indicating an adequate depth or tidal volume. When a patient breathes adequately, as I said, the chest expands normally. It's in a normal rhythm. It's effortless. I'm not having to work to take a deep breath. When a patient is considered inadequate, something is wrong. Either they're breathing too fast, they're breathing too slow. They're not getting enough air in. So they may be breathing in an irregular rhythm. So they may be going breath, breath, hold, breath, breath, hold. They may have diminished or absent breath sounds to one side, or inadequate chest expansion. So they may be expanding on the right side but not on the left. They may have what's called cyanosis, or a bluish tint to their skin, indicating that they're not getting enough oxygen. Or they may be breathing agonal, or those gaspy respirations that we would see in patients in cardiac arrest. Our circulatory system, this is a closed system that is used to transport blood and various nutrients and oxygen to tissues of the body. Our circulatory system is comprised of our heart and blood vessels and the blood. It also has various other functions besides just transporting blood and nutrients. It also provides a medium for the perfusion of cells throughout our body. It transports blood to our alveoli for gas exchange as well as the cells. So because our cells need oxygen as well. It also assists as a medium for buffering our blood's pH or acid-base balance. Also assists in the promotion of clotting of our blood, as well as delivering our immune systems, or excuse me, our immune cells, and the various necessities or parts that are needed for our immune system. Within our cardiovascular system, you have arteries that carry blood away from the heart, veins that carries blood towards the heart, and capillaries, which is the sites where exchange is made between blood and tissues. Within our heart, you have two sections. You have four chambers, but the upper chambers are called the atria. That's what I was trying to get out. The atria receives blood from veins. The right atrium receives oxygen-depleted blood from the veins of the body, and the left atrium receives oxygen-rich blood from the pulmonary veins from the lungs. The lower chambers are what's called ventricles. They pump blood out to arteries. The right ventricle pumps oxygen-depleted blood to the pulmonary arteries, which then transports the blood to the lungs where it will be oxygenated. The left ventricle pumps oxygen-rich blood to the major arteries from the heart through the aorta. Okay? And then you have a series of valves between the chambers of heart which prevent the blood from flowing, that keeps the blood flowing in one direction and prevents the backflow of blood into the chambers that it just came from. So these valves would be your tricuspid and bicuspid valve, and your pulmonic and aortic valve. So blood comes in from the body, and it goes into the right atrium. It then goes from the right atrium into the tricuspid valve. It then goes from the tricuspid valve into the, let me find my tracing, into the pulmonary, into the lung, into the pulmonary artery. Okay. From there, goes to the lungs, comes back from the lungs to the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein is the only vein that will ever carry oxygenated blood, and the pulmonary artery is the only one that will carry deoxygenated blood. So it carries it back in, comes into the left atrium. It then goes through the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve, into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle it goes to the aortic valve, into the aorta, and then into systemic circulation. We also have major arteries that go through our blood system. So we just discussed the aortic artery, which is the one that comes directly out of our heart. You have your coronary arteries, which are the arteries that supply blood to our heart. So because our heart is a living muscle as well. You have your carotid arteries. These are the arteries that go up through your neck into your brain. Femoral arteries, which are the major arteries that goes through your legs. And you have your brachial artery, which goes into your arms. That runs down your left and right arm and into your hands. So you have your right coronary artery, left coronary artery. The apex of the heart is the inferior portion, or the bottom, and the base is the top portion of the heart. Your capillary beds, these are tiny blood vessels that connects an arteriole, which is at the end of the arteries. So as the artery gets bigger, or it goes from artery to arteriole, from there it goes into your capillaries, which then connects it to a venule, or to your veins. These capillaries have walls that allow for the exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste at the cellular level. All fluid, oxygen, and carbon dioxide exchange takes place between blood and tissue cells through the walls of a capillary in all parts of the body. Within your venous system, so you have your venules. This is the smallest branch of the vein. These are connected to your distal ends of capillaries. It then goes up the venule through a variety of valves to prevent backflow, up into the veins and into the vena cava, which then drops the blood off into your right atrium. Pulmonary veins, these carries blood away from the heart to the lungs. Or excuse me, from the lungs to the heart. I'm sorry, I got it backwards. So as I said earlier, the pulmonary veins is the only vein that will ever carry oxygenated blood. Within our cardiac conduction system, so this is what assists in our automaticity. Our primary pacemaker is the sinoatrial node, or SA node. From this node, it allows our heart to be able to beat at a normal rhythm, anywhere from 80 to 100 beats per minute. It then goes from the SA node down the internodal pathway to the AV node. So if the SA node fails, the AV node then takes over. If the AV node is firing as primary, our heartbeat is anywhere from 60 to 80 beats per minute. From there, it goes down the bundle of His to the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers is what causes your ventricles to contract. Okay? And if the AV node fails, the signal then is based off of the Purkinje fibers, and if the Purkinje fibers are a primary pacemaker, our pulse is about 20 to 30 beats per minute. Within our blood, we have red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Red blood cells carries hemoglobin. This allows allows our cells to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout our bloodstream. This is what gives blood its red color. White blood cells are part of our immune system and helps defend against infections. Platelets are cells within our blood that help defend against infection, that helps form blood clots. And plasma is the actual liquid portion of our blood that allows these substances to be carried throughout our body. When the left ventricle contracts, this sends a wave of blood throughout our arteries. This pulse or wave of propelled blood is what's felt at various points, called pulse points. Simply put, this pulse can be felt at any point where an artery passes over a bone near the skin surface, such as when we palpate our radial pulse. Okay? This pulse is a measure of the effectiveness of the left ventricle as a pump and provides information about the volume of blood being ejected by the left ventricle and carried by the arteries. We have our central pulses. These are our carotid and femoral. The reason they are called central pulses is because they are located more centrally, closer to the heart. The peripheral pulses, these are located on the periphery of the body or furthest from the heart, these being your radial, brachial, posterior and tibial, and dorsalis pedis pulses. Blood pressure. This is the force exerted by the blood on the interior walls of the arteries. The systolic blood pressure is a measurement of the amount of force exerted along the walls of the arteries when the left ventricle contracts. This is the top number when we are getting our blood pressure. The diastolic blood pressure, or the bottom number, is the amount of pressure exerted on the walls when the left ventricle is at rest or in between contractions. The systolic blood pressure is when we measure it, we are measuring the effectiveness of the pumping function of the left ventricle, whereas the diastolic pressure is we're measuring the effectiveness of the resistance in the arteries between contractions. Okay. Another type of pressure found inside our vessels is what's called the hydrostatic pressure. This is the force exerted on the inside of the vessel walls because of the blood pressure and the volume of blood. A significant increase in the hydrostatic pressure can cause blood to escape the capillaries and be forced through the capillary wall, thus causing fluid to leak into our cellular space. And this is why you get edema or swelling. This thus causes gas exchange to become more difficult and less effective. So when you lose hydrostatic pressure, okay, you have plasma proteins escaping the permeability, thus causing fluid to escape into the extracellular space. So now we can't get proper perfusion to occur. And when this happens, it causes edema or swelling. If it happens within the lungs, you have what's called pulmonary edema and fluid starting to build up in the lungs. If you have it happening in the legs or in the hands, it's called peripheral edema, and you have the swelling in the feet or in the ankles or hands. Perfusion is the delivery of oxygen, glucose, and other nutrients to the cells of all organ systems and the elimination of carbon dioxide and other waste products, thus resulting in the constant adequate circulation of blood through the capillaries. When there's an insufficient supply of oxygen or nutrients due to some reason, such as not enough fluid, malnutrition, whatever, this is when you have hypoperfusion or shock, because now we have an inadequate elimination of carbon dioxide and other wastes resulting from that inadequate circulation of blood. When this happens for a period of time, this can cause a depression of vital processes of the body and areas of the body beginning to shut down. Two of the most important gases that we need to be concerned with is oxygen and carbon dioxide. Cells require oxygen to be able to function effectively and survive. If we don't have oxygen, we die. Carbon dioxide is a waste byproduct that is given off by our cells as they go through metabolism. These need to be carried away from the cells to be eliminated by the lungs. If this doesn't happen, we get what's called anaerobic metabolism, and you have acid beginning to build up. Oxygen is carried in two different ways, whereas carbon dioxide is eliminated in carried in three different ways. 97% of our oxygen is carried on our hemoglobin throughout our blood, whereas 3% of our oxygen is dissolved in plasma. Whereas carbon dioxide, 70% of our carbon dioxide is carried in plasma in the form of bicarb. And this assists in the pH level of our blood. 23% of it is attached to hemoglobin, which is then transported to our lungs to eventually be breathed out. And then 7% of our carbon dioxide is dissolved within our plasma. As I said earlier, cells require energy to survive. Our main source of energy is glucose, or a simple sugar molecule, which is metabolized within the cell. In an ideal state, glucose metabolism occurs with adequate amounts of oxygen present. The metabolized glucose provides large amounts of energy for these cells to use. The final byproducts of glucose metabolism are water, heat, and carbon dioxide. In an ideal state, this carbon dioxide is then transported away from the cell in one of the methods previously discussed and blown off by the lungs. This kind of metabolism is known as aerobic metabolism, meaning metabolism with oxygen. If oxygen is not available when the cell is metabolizing this glucose, very little energy is then produced for the cell, and the end product is called acid. This acid is bad for the body if it begins to accumulate. This process of metabolizing glucose without producing much energy is known as anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic meaning without oxygen. So an example of this is when you are working out and you start feeling that pain in your joints. It is because these areas are without oxygen and it's going through anaerobic metabolism. And you have what's called pyruvic acid beginning to form. Y'all bear with me, we're almost done. The nervous system controls the voluntary and involuntary activity of the human body. It enables our body to maintain a state of awareness, whether we're awake or confused or unresponsive. It also allows us to react to our environment. It coordinates responses of the body to the various stimuli that we may come across and keeps our body systems working together. It also carries impulses from tissue to organs to nerve centers within our brain, and then in return from these nerve centers back to the various tissues and organs to react based off of the stimuli. So when we place our hand on a hot stove, that signal goes from our hand to our brain back again in a matter of milliseconds saying, hey, get your hand off that hot stove. Within our nervous system, we have two structural divisions. You have your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. Your central nervous system consists of the brain and your spinal cord. Your brain being the control center of your nervous system, which is quite possibly one of the most highly specialized organs within our body. The brain does not store any glucose, but however, it requires a constant supply. So if you lose glucose, one of the first things that is affected is your brain. There are three subdivisions of your brain: the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. The pons, which is a smaller subdivision of the brain, acts as a bridge that connects all three sections. Your spinal cord is approximately 18 inches long and is an extension of the brainstem. The major function of the spinal cord is the conduction of nerve impulses as it enters and leaves the spinal cord at various levels. So it brings in these nerve impulses, brings it up to the brain, gets a determination, and sends it back down. Your peripheral nervous system is everything that breaks off of the brainstem and intertwines throughout the body. Your cerebrum is the larger portion of the brain. This controls your sensation and thought and also manages all of your conscious movements. Your brainstem, which is comprised of your midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, controls your respiratory, cardiac, and vasomotor functions. Your cerebellum, which is this section here, coordinates all of your muscle activity and maintains balance based off of input from your eyes and ears. As I said earlier, peripheral nervous system is everything based off of your spinal cord. You have afferent neurons, which is your sensory neurons, and you have efferent neurons, which controls your motor functions. You have two different functional divisions of the nervous system. You have the voluntary nervous system and your autonomic nervous system. Your voluntary nervous system influences all the activity of your skeletal muscles. So all of the muscles that you can consciously control is controlled off of the voluntary nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is what's also known as your fight or flight reflex. So when you are about to get into a fight, your sympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, activates. Excuse me. And this is what triggers and causes an increase in your pulse rate, increase in blood pressure. You're able to focus more, and it causes various other effects within the body. Your parasympathetic nervous system returns the body back to a sense of normalcy. So it is your cool down, and it tries to return your body back to a sense of normal. On this slide, which is illustrated on page 160, covers what exactly the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system does. I would recommend looking over this. Your nervous system, it also controls, as I said earlier, your consciousness and unconsciousness. This relies on your central hemispheres and the reticular activating system, or RAS. In order for you to be awake, your RAS and central hemispheres have to be coordinating together. When one of these hemispheres are not functioning properly, or your RAS is not functioning properly, that is when you result in unconsciousness. Your endocrine system is made up of ductless glands, which helps regulate the body through secretions called hormones. These hormones have various effects on the activity of certain organs. These hormones are then carried by the bloodstream to all parts of the body, affecting your physical strength, mental ability, stature, reproduction, just to name a few. How you think and act also depends largely on these secretions. These glands discharge secretions directly into the bloodstream. Good health depends on a well-balanced output of hormones. Endocrine imbalance yields profound changes in growth, and serious changes entail emotional, physical, and sexual behavior. Your endocrine system glands are in a variety of different places, which is pictured on page 161. I'm only going to go over a couple of these. I would recommend looking in your book to see some of the others. Your pineal gland helps regulate circadian rhythm. Excuse me. Your thyroid, which is in your anterior neck, helps regulate metabolism. Your adrenal glands, which sit atop your kidneys, secrete your epinephrine or adrenaline. The islets of Langerhans produces insulin, which allows glucose to enter cells. And the thymus gland, which is in the neck superior to the heart, secretes the hormone thymosin, which helps in the development and maturation of your immune system. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline and norepinephrine, are two hormones secreted by the adrenal gland. These hormones produce many of the signs and symptoms seen in patients when the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated. To understand these signs and symptoms that are produced, you must first understand the basics of the four effects, alpha 1 and 2 and beta 1 and 2, activated by these hormones. Norepinephrine has mostly alpha 1 and alpha 2 properties, with lesser beta 1 and 2 properties. The primary effects of norepinephrine are on the blood vessels. The body, when they release epinephrine and norepinephrine, it is to help compensate for shock. Alpha 1 affects vasoconstriction, which makes the skin appear cool and pale, thus causing an increase in sweat production, making skin appear to be clammy or moist. Alpha 2 helps in the regulation of alpha 1 effects. Beta 1 causes an increase in your heart rate, contractility, and speed of cardiac electrical conduction. And beta 2 causes dilation of your bronchioles and blood vessels. Your integumentary system, this is your skin. This separates the body from the outside environment. This has a variety of different functions, pending it's doing its job and it is intact. It helps protect your body from the environment, such as bacteria. Helps regulation in body temperature. It serves as a receptor for our senses and aids in the regulation of water and electrolytes through the process of sweat and release of sodium chloride. There are three layers of your integumentary system: your epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous layer. The epidermis, being the outermost layer, is mostly composed of dying and dead cells that are sloughed off as new cells replace them. Melanin, which creates the color of your skin, is in the deepest layers of your epidermis. The dermis, or the second layer of your skin, is much thicker. This contains a vast network of blood vessels that supply the skin as well as the hair follicles, oil glands, and sensory nerves. Composed of dense connective tissue, the dermis gives the skin its elasticity and strength. Just below the dermis is a layer of fatty tissue called the subcutaneous layer, or subcutaneous connective tissue. It varies in thickness depending on what part of the body it covers. Subcutaneous tissue of the eyelids, for example, is thin, but that of the abdomen and buttocks is very thick. So you have your epidermis, your dermis, and subcutaneous layer. Your arteries and nerves and veins are all run through the subcutaneous layer. Your digestive system, this is composed of the alimentary tract, or that passage through which food travels, and the accessory muscles, which are organs that help prepare food for absorption and use by tissues of the body. The main functions of the digestive system are to ingest and carry food so that absorption can occur and waste can be eliminated. Your digestive system is comprised of your stomach, which secretes acid and also mixes food to start digestion. But that's not where digestion begins. It begins within your oral cavity. As you're chewing your food, enzymes are beginning to be released to begin in the digestion. Then goes down your esophagus to your stomach, where it continues being broken down. It then goes into your intestines and into your small intestines and eventually into your colon. There are two processes for the digestive process. You have mechanical digestion, which is the process of you chewing, and chemical digestion, which is the enzymes or digestive juices that breaks food down into simple components that can be absorbed and used by the body. Any carbohydrates that are eaten are converted into glucose or sugar, and any fats are changed into fatty acids, and proteins are then converted into amino acids, which is used actually as part of your DNA. Your urinary and renal system helps filter in the filtration and excretion of waste from the blood through urine. It consists of two kidneys, which filters waste from the bloodstream and helps control fluid balance. You have two ureters, which carries the waste from the kidneys to your bladder, one bladder which stores the urine, and one urethra which carries urine from the bladder out of the body. The kidneys also play an important role in your blood pressure regulation as well as red blood cell production. Also, during the process of urine formation, waste is removed from the circulating blood from urine from elimination. And any products that is found useful within this waste is then returned to your bloodstream. So kidney function is very important to maintain a normal acid-base balance within your body. When you begin losing kidney function, going into kidney failure, that's when you have to start considering dialysis. The reproductive system of women and men consists of complementary organs that can function to accomplish human reproduction. The male sperm and the female's ovum contribute the genes that determine the hereditary characteristics of an offspring. A combination of a single sperm with a single ovum forms a fertilized ovum, which then grows into an embryo, then into a fetus, and finally into a newborn baby. Within your male reproductive system, you have your testes, which produces sperm and secretes testosterone, your epididymis that stores the sperm, vas deferens, which transports sperm to the urethra, seminal vesicles, your prostate gland, which secretes fluid for the semen, and and then your penis, which ends up delivering the semen during intercourse. The male reproductive system is the only our reproductive system also is intertwined with our urinary system, whereas the female reproductive system is completely separate from their urinary system. The female reproductive system, it consists of 2 ovaries, 2 fallopian tubes, the uterus, vagina, and the external genitals. The ovaries produce and secrete estrogen and progesterone, which is the primary hormones for the female. Medical terminology is a special type of language that is used in all fields of medicine, and what it does, it simplifies complex words into an understanding of combining forms such as suffixes and prefixes, such as hypovolemic, meaning hypo, below normal, vol, meaning volume, emic, meaning pertaining to the blood, which means a meaning pertaining to a below normal volume of blood. They have low blood volume. Bradypnea, brady meaning slow, piani meaning breathing, a meaning condition, is a condition of a slow breathing rate. So it takes multiple different things, brings it into one to help simplify things to where we can understand. Alright guys, that's it for today. If y'all have any questions, just shoot me a message. I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. If y'all have any, otherwise, I will see y'all in class. I promise I will try not to have these slides so long.